leadership within LEAF and how leadership comes about, and then it grew into a bigger kind of project looking at social leadership in early childhood education. So we start here. Now, I think probably everybody in this Zoom room agrees that early childhood education has a social purpose. I put money on it, that we kind of associate the field of early childhood education with having a social purpose. And by that, I mean essentially making society fairer. So if you think about the kind of two economic tenets of social justice, so the redistribution of resources and establishing a really strong safety net, then early childhood education is key to both of those things, right? So it's about redistributing resources to those very youngest children and their families, and it also acts as a safety net within society. So it's not particularly controversial to say early childhood education has this social purpose. And in fact, I go further and say it's not particularly controversial to say that many of us are in this field because of that social purpose and because of a commitment to social justice. The issue is that the realities of the sector mean it's not just a question, unfortunately, of taking that social purpose and running with it. Why? Because the realities of the early childhood education sector are quite complex and quite messy. And this is the case in the UK, the context that I know most closely, but it's also the case in lots of parts of the world. That what we have within the sector is quite an unhappy mixed economy of provision. So we have private providers, lots of private provision, but then within that we've got kind of huge discrepancies or huge diversity. So we've got single site, family run nursery businesses and childminders, of course. We've also got all the way through to huge nursery chains driven through venture capital. Alongside the private provision, we've got some state provision. We've got some charitable provision. We've also got kind of mixed or hybrid provision. So, for example, social enterprise, which works on its own kind of logic. So we have this mixed economy. And the reason why I say it's an unhappy mixed economy is because there is a sense of precariousness across the sector. So for example, a recent report by the Early Years Alliance showed that I think it was 25% of private providers within the UK context think they will go under as a result of COVID. And that's not just a statement about COVID, that's a statement about their precarious reality before the pandemic. Okay, so there is kind of systemic underinvestment in the sector. As a result, there's this fragmentation, sometimes even antagonisms within the sector. Why does that all matter? Ultimately, because we fail children and families from backgrounds of most disadvantage. So we do not manage to provide enough early childhood education. We don't manage to provide the right early childhood education to the children and the families that most need it. So that social purpose that's driving us so much of the time, the difficult realities of the sector make it very hard to actually achieve that social purpose. So we're in a bit of a pickle, a conundrum. Now within that, you bring kind of leadership into the mix. And what happens is a really natural and understandable response to that fragmentation, to that messiness, to that complexity of the sector. And so you get these models of leadership that are really kind of clear responses to the fragmentation, in that they present leadership as a juggle, as a really kind of exhausting juggling act of all the things that you have to make work in order to be a good leader within early childhood education. So you've got to juggle the pedagogical bit. You've got to juggle the managing of staff. You've got to somehow make the books balance. You've got to do all these kind of elements, the work with families and so on, and you've got to keep them all in the mix all of the time. Alternatively, you get kind of bits of leadership being broken away to be theorized or modeled separately. So for example, pedagogical leadership. And there's huge and amazing and beautiful writing about pedagogical leadership within early childhood education. And June and myself have just submitted an edited manuscript to Bloomsbury all about pedagogical leadership and perspectives from around the world on pedagogical leadership. But it's like taking that bit of leadership and removing it from the complexity and trying to theorize it separately. And so what happens in that kind of view of leadership as a juggling act or as separate bits is that potentially we lose that focus on social purpose. So the amazing Professor Julie Nicholson, working in San Francisco, talks about this. She talks about the lack of leadership theories and models that think about it in terms of social purpose and social justice. She conducted with colleagues a review in 2020 of all the literature around, recent literature on leadership within the sector, and basically concludes that, okay, great, we've got some really interesting stuff here, but where does the social justice go? Where does the equity go? So this is the kind of dilemma that June and I were starting with. It's, okay, how do you model leadership in early childhood education with all that complexity of the sector there, but how do you model it in a way that brings that social purpose really to the fore, makes it the center of everything that's happening? And it's really important to say that we're not saying we need to invent that kind of leadership, and nor is Julie Nicholson for that matter. We're not saying that it doesn't happen already. What we're suggesting is that we can do more to model it, so to name it, to understand what it's made up of, to understand the conditions that enable it to thrive. And then by doing that, you can actually encourage and agitate for more of it, and you can agitate for the conditions that enable it to thrive. So that's our kind of, that's the task that we set ourselves. And I will talk about why I'm talking about a social purpose lens as opposed to a social justice lens. That will become apparent a little bit later. So there were two parts of the research that June and I undertook. The first part was an in-depth case study within LEAF. So why LEAF? LEAF is the organisation that June runs, London Early Years Foundation. It has two focuses that make it really fertile ground for this investigation. One is that as a social enterprise, that focus on social purpose runs through the organisation on all levels and is really palpable. Post-pandemic, if you have an opportunity and you haven't already, do try and visit a LEAF setting, because that sense of social purpose is really clear and apparent. The second focus that they have that means it's fertile ground for this kind of work is this focus on leadership development. That when you join the organisation, let's say as an apprentice, there is a focus on developing you as a leader, and they use the language of leadership very explicitly again across the organisation. So with that focus on social purpose and that focus on leadership development, the idea was, okay, there'd be some readiness here to really engage with those conversations about what leadership with a social purpose, what we're calling social leadership, what it really looks like, what it really means, what it feels like. So I spent time across 4 of the LEAF nurseries and different kinds of nurseries within the organisation. So I spent time in a nursery that has quite an affluent community, serves quite an affluent community and turns a profit. I spent time within a nursery that's one of their social impact nurseries. So this is a nursery that has 100% funded places and then extra subsidization from within LEAF to support further the work that happens in that nursery. And then 2 of the nurseries which were kind of more mixed intake and essentially break even. And across those 4 settings, I conducted 18 interviews with nursery staff, 18 in-depth interviews with nursery staff, and they really ranged from, apprentices who had joined the organisation 4 months ago to managers that have been working with LEAF for 25 years and longer within the early years sector. also interviewed a couple of members of LEAF's head office, so the pedagogy manager, and also the sustainability lead, and of course conversations with June herself. Now, there's tons coming out from that exploration, but I think the thing I just want to draw attention to here is that our takeaway after that first phase of the research is that social purpose isn't just about the ends of leadership. So it's not just about having a vision of what a fairer society looks like and how early childhood education might play into that and feed into that, but it's also about the kind of very everyday actions that make up leadership. And it's about how that sense of social purpose reverberates through how you lead. So actually the kind of words that were coming out from those interviews about what it means to be a leader were much more to do with how you govern yourself and you behave as a leader in the everyday environment, and how you show your social purpose through your kindness, through your warmth, through your willingness to kind of build rapport with everybody, through your commitment to the participation of everybody, to inclusion, to giving voice. So we really came away with the sense, okay, we need a model that does both, that talks about this vision of a fairer society and driving social purpose, but also relates to how you do that in a very everyday context and in those kind of micro interactions that you have every day. So the second part of the research we panned out, and we wanted to engage more broadly across the sector and internationally. So we carried out 14 in-depth conversations, and I say conversations here because they really were dialogues rather than kind of straight research interviews, as is often the case, with early childhood education leaders or leader groups who work around the world. And they were really amazing conversations. Like, I can honestly say that these conversations were probably the most stimulating professional experience I've ever had, in the sense that getting to speak to people that had often given their entire careers to driving social purpose through early childhood education was just absolutely fascinating and inspiring. So everybody who came on board with that part of the research, they identified with that idea that they led with a social purpose. That was the kind of starting point. So they recognized that that was important to them. And then the dialogue was really trying to grasp, okay, so what does that mean to you actually? What does it really mean to lead with a social purpose in early childhood education? What does it look like? What does it feel like? How do you do it? When does it become a challenge? What gets in the way? What are the conditions that really help you to lead with that social purpose? And from there, we had these, beautiful, and still do have these beautiful transcripts that I think make good bedtime reading generally. And we had, thousands of keywords coming out of that and phrases and lots and lots and lots of stories. And we tried to boil that down to something that we could package as a model. And we came up with these 5 elements of social leadership in early childhood education, which I'm going to run through today. But just before I do, I thought I'd share with you who participated in these interviews so you can get a sense of where this is coming from. So here are the kind of names, positions, where they are in the world, of who participated in these conversations. And there's just a couple of things to kind of notice, I think, about this list. So one is, yes, there are some interesting national contexts here. There's some diversity in terms of national contexts. So as well as all parts of the UK, there's Australia, there's Canada, there's the US, there's Turkey, there's Malaysia, there's Iceland, but not nearly as much as we'd like, right? And so we're seeing these conversations as a starting point. So the model that comes out of these conversations is a working model. It's a work in progress. And we're really keen to have more and more and more of these conversations across increasingly diverse contexts. The second point to note, and I think this is fascinating, to me anyway, it's fascinating. And I'd like to kind of think about it separately, and we don't have time to go into lots of detail about it here, but just worth noticing like the diversity in terms of organizational context. So even if you look across the top line of this grid, we have charitable provision, state provision, private provider who's grown a business from 1 nursery to now I think it's 27 nurseries, and we have a big social enterprise whose one of their arms is early childhood education, but actually they're about community regeneration and renewal more broadly, working in Toronto. So this organizational context diversity is really interesting, because what we're seeing is maybe that social leadership, leading with a social purpose, doesn't need to be exclusively belonging to, let's say, state provision or charitable provision, that actually there's this kind of hybridity in this middle space between lots of organizational contexts where actually that social leadership becomes possible. So the model, the bare bones of the model. So here are the 5 elements that we kind of passed out as being particularly interesting. Now, these are not everything that social leaders do, but it seems that social leaders put their energy and kind of attention into these elements in order to drive the changes that they want to see. So I'm going to try and run through each of these now briefly and try to bring it to life with a couple of examples, and then we can hopefully tackle them in a bit more detail through the dialogue. So there's leading with a social purpose, driving a social pedagogy, creating a culture of collaborative innovation, investing in others' leadership, and facilitating powerful conversations. So first, leading with a social purpose. So it's the foundation, it's where we started, it's how we recruited people for those in-depth conversations, and it's where we end. So you can't be a social leader without a social purpose. Now here's this tricky bit, and we toyed with, you know, should we just say that this is about social justice? This is about driving social justice. It's a term that both June and I have used quite a lot. What we found is that in those conversations with leaders around the world, sometimes that phrase social justice really resonated, and sometimes it didn't. And when it didn't resonate, it wasn't because they were anti-social justice. It was just because the phrase didn't really land. It wasn't how they thought about necessarily what they were doing. So social purpose as a phrase, they felt, yeah, I can tell you what my social purpose is. Social justice, for some of them, it was like, okay, I'm going to need to go and look up exactly what that means and check with you that it relates to what I'm doing. So I think we wanted to stay with this social purpose because it felt like there was more room then for this kind of context-specific, lived sense of social purpose. And just to give you an example of what I mean when I say context-specific social purpose, you know, it could be about serving a particular group that many don't think about. So Chantel Williams, who was incredible to speak to, I mean, everybody was, but Chantel was particularly fun, talked about how she'd have grown her business with this kind of constant social purpose in her mind, which was to do with empowering parents, typically mums, who lived in really rural and isolated parts of Tasmania in Australia. And she was aware that they were not a priority in terms of government funding and government support. They were not seen as a priority. But her interaction with these parents convinced her, we're doing something really useful for these parents and important for these parents. We're giving them a social network and a social support system that they wouldn't have otherwise. And that was her social purpose. That was the social purpose that ran through Stepping Stones as a business, which operated as a private business. Now, the social purpose comes to life in the organization through a social pedagogy. So we're using that phrase to describe kind of a pedagogy that's explicitly designed to enable the social purpose. So again, it's context specific, it's adapted to the community. So you'll see here, these are the 7 strands of LEAF's pedagogy, of LEAF's social pedagogy. And running all the way through Leaf's pedagogy is this commitment to social capital. So this idea that we can enrich, through pedagogy, we can enrich the social capital of children and families. And when I say social capital, I don't mean the fancy person you know who gets you that amazing internship at the age of 22. It might be that, but it's actually about the strength of the connections that you have within the community that you live and who you know to access in order to support you in a particular way, or how you can give support in a particular way. So whether it's through kind of dialogic reading, whether it's through the involvement of parents and grandparents, something they're deeply committed to, or whether it's about kind of going for lots of walks to the local market and having many conversations with the local fishmonger, this kind of commitment to social capital is made real through the social pedagogy. Okay, and that's a relationship that we saw across these early childhood education settings. You have your social purpose, but you bring it to life through the social pedagogy. So the third one is around culture, which excited me because you might remember that's why I reached out to June originally, was to understand more about the culture within Leaf. And we found a kind of across these social leaders talking about what they do and how they run their organizations and how they work, that the key thing here was collaboration, and really quite radical levels of collaboration. So yes, there was collaboration within the organization. So typically by minimizing hierarchies and minimizing the focus on hierarchies. So particularly participatory team meetings seem to be a good way of kind of recognizing whether or not this was happening. But also, as well as the collaboration within the organization, there was this push for collaboration that goes beyond traditional early childhood education borders. So whether that's collaborations with health, whether that's collaborations with the arts. And what I'm not talking about here is kind of anticipated interprofessional working. So kind of systems that are set up that work more or less well in different places, but collaborations that are really trying to disrupt what's expected and what's anticipated. So Nurpur Ulker, who is a child development expert at UNICEF, has spent her life working predominantly in Turkey for UNICEF, talks about her career as the push, the constant push to position early childhood education in the context of health and social policy and enable it to flourish through that collaborative work. And then that on a much more local level, Jacqueline Lamb, who's the CEO of Indigo Childcare Group in Glasgow, talked about her current struggle, and I think it still is a current struggle and hasn't yet been achieved, but to get a speech and language therapist seconded from the NHS into one of her nurseries. That was the collaboration that she felt would make a real difference to children and families. So there's this willingness to disrupt the status quo in order to get the collaborations that enable the social purpose to happen. The other thing that social leaders do is invest in others' leadership. So they are quick to give their power away. They spend a lot of time and energy drawing out the leadership capacities in others. That's really important in the context of a sector where we have a lot of reluctant leadership, where much of the workforce have been disenfranchised in relation to thinking about themselves as leaders. And so there's often a sense, and I get this even with my kind of early childhood studies students, I'm not a leader, you know, I can't think of myself in that way. And actually social leaders flip that wholeheartedly and use the language of leadership with everybody unabashedly. So I love this quote from Peter Frampton at the Learning Enrichment Foundation, where he talks about assuming authority. So he says, when it comes to leadership, we have this idea that authority is given. It's not, it's assumed. And so part of the trick is to assume that they, the ECE professionals, have the authority in the first place. And he goes on to talk about, you know, you have to back that up with training, and you have to back that up with coaching, and you have to really create the support network that enables that to flourish. But the baseline is everybody here is a leader. And that's the kind of starting point for everything that happens. The final element is really about enabling all those other elements to work. So facilitating powerful conversations is what enables then those other 4 elements to really take root. Social leaders are great conversationalists, and I don't just mean that they tell great stories, which they do, but they use conversations in order to make change. And that's what we mean by powerful conversations. A powerful conversation is one in which a change happens. A change in somebody's mind, a change in somebody's intention to act in a particular way, a change in how somebody reflects on an experience that they've had. And so if you think about the other elements, in order to build that leadership I was just talking about, well, you need those really powerful coaching conversations. To build that social pedagogy, you need those pedagogical conversations to be integral. And to grow that sense of kind of shared social purpose, you need community conversations. And this is where social media can come in, and understanding what it might be to do a powerful conversation through social media, and what those look like and what those feel like. So we've got some time for dialogue. I'm going to finish there. Main things I hope I'm leaving you with is a sense of optimism. I definitely feel optimistic. So despite the mess, the underinvestment, the fragmentation in the sector, looking around and kind of seeing social leadership in all its guises, in all its kind of richness, is really a thing that makes me feel very optimistic. And I think it's a modest contribution, but a contribution nonetheless, to grow it by trying to observe it, by trying to understand it, by trying to model it. And by understanding the conditions in which it flourishes, it becomes much more possible to advocate for those conditions in a meaningful way. So yes, I'm looking forward to questions and comments, and thank you very much.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Mona. So much to digest and think about and reflect upon. So let me just take a look at chat. There was one comment from Taran. Would you like to convey that to Mona directly and maybe follow it with a question?
I feel like I've been put on the spot. I was hoping people will have wise things to say, and now I need to say something that sounds half smart. Just wanted to say that was, I think, if I may, since you gave me the chance, Jane, that was a very interesting hook on where we are in the earlier sector. I happen to work at the Lega Foundation, and having worked on programs across the world, I see threads of that alive. So thanks, Mona, for kind of shedding light on it, and I hope it resonates with the primarily British audience that I see here. Maybe I'm making some assumptions, so please correct me if I'm wrong. I guess my only question is maybe not for Mona, but for the larger group that's on here, right? We're together in this in trying to figure out how does early years become the bulwark or one of the backbones of growth or social development in the years to follow. And I've just been wondering how we find pathways in common, and what is the potential of powerful ideas such as these to just grow and be in our minds, because we're seeing leadership from finance and healthcare and AI and tech. And I just feel like developing the next generation is possibly the most important of them all. So I'm not really sure that's a clear question, but that's a thought. And I'm really curious as to what the room evolves into in the conversation that we have. But thanks again for that beautiful book, Mona.
Thanks, Taryn. What you were saying made me think of something that Brett Vicdort mentioned in his conversation. And he obviously comes from his Teach First background of leading Teach First in the UK, and then moving into trying to do something within early years through Tiny. And he said, it's amazing, isn't it, that we can make all of these kind of accountants think that they are leaders, and yet it's so hard to make early childhood education professionals see that they are leaders, and so there's a real that is, so true, and such a great observation, but it's also a really sad one in the sense that we've got this workforce who are doing something so important and so fundamental, but who are disempowered and who are not kind of ready to take on that mantle of being a leader. But but then at the same time, I wonder, do we try enough? I think about kind of the early childhood studies degree that I'm lucky enough to teach on, and I think it's an amazing degree. But then one of the things I would love us to do is to kind of map leadership within that degree, because isn't that one of the things that we could be doing more of, or bringing to the sector and bringing to those individuals that sense of being leaders?
Okay, I'm going to take the liberty of asking you a question. Having researched not so much leadership but professionalism in early childhood for a good while, one of the kind of things that was central to my research was issues of gender and issues of social class. And the thing that strikes me is that leadership is a complex and interesting concept as well as practice, and it is a sort of collaborative endeavour, and it can drive social justice or social purpose, but it's also a very tall order. If people the workforce are typically on the minimum wage, working maximum hours with very low status, and that doesn't seem to shift, decade upon decade, and the policy attention and investment and so on, we have this perennial state of a workforce that's undervalued, underinvested, and therefore, this whilst I can see the benefit and the value of kind of promoting the idea of more responsibility and taking the lead in achieving greater social justice and social equality, that's all laudable, but that's another burden on the shoulders of an already creaking workforce. So how do you kind of reconcile those tensions and difficulties?
I think it's such a good question, Jane, and like one that I kind of think about a lot. I think I have an issue with the idea, and this is where I've got to after lots of thinking and reflection, and it's ongoing, so this isn't a final end point. But I'm not sure that staying with that position of real, it's a workforce crisis, and it's not just that the workforce is in crisis, it's that individuals are being treated really poorly within the sector. So it's a crisis from the individual's point of view as well. And so I'm not sure, though, that staying in that place actually really helps anybody. So I don't think saying to somebody, God, you're really overworked and underpaid, and let's just kind of draw a line there, I don't think that helps them. Or I think ultimately it's quite a kind of, it's a condescending starting point. I was really struck by an interview I did with two coaches, Barbara Blender and Eliana Elias in the US, and they talked about, when we speak to members of the early childhood education workforce, and it's quite a similar situation in California as it is in the UK, one of the things we never want to do is just stay with their stress and their sense of having the weight of the world on their shoulders, because actually we're not doing them a favor by staying in that place. And by kind of agitating for change and shifts, and yes, that might mean them taking more responsibility but also maybe taking more meaning from work as a result of that responsibility. But they do then start to have kind of realizations, kind of consciousness raising essentially about their situation, which then can lead on to things like the advocacy work. And so they talk about working with lots of professionals who start with a quite individual journey of, I want to get better at this, or this is my vision for early childhood education, and my part in it is this, and doing that quite individual work, but in the context having this awareness of my God, my employer treats me like rubbish. This isn't good enough. And actually, I'm going to make a stand for this. And I'm going to join this advocacy group. And it doesn't always work like that, but can work like that. So I think I justify it on that basis, that actually that process of saying, well, could we bring more leadership in here, is not just about making things better for children. It would eventually be about making things better for everybody.
Okay.
You know, I'm really aware of that kind of tension.
Yeah, I could see us having a conversation about that for hours. But anyway, just Lee and Lena both have questions in the chat. So Lee's question is regarding policy. Do these leaders that have been involved in your research feel that policy helps or hinders them? In what ways do they talk about policy, or if at all?
Yeah, it's really interesting. They definitely did talk about policy, and obviously they were working within kind of their own policy contexts. So the biggest challenge that was coming out time and time again in all of the conversations really was around underinvestment in the workforce. So it was about, the government say, so for example, in an Australian context, it would be the government say that I need to employ a person with this level of qualification, but actually A, it's a struggle to be able to afford that, and B, those qualifications don't actually give us what I think we need. And that was kind of a repeated refrain across the conversation. So essentially it was a kind of, the overall attitude, I would say, was skepticism about how much policy would dictate about what was needed within the setting, but without the investment that would enable that to be delivered in a way that felt effective to those leaders. So generally, overall, if I had to characterize the relationship between social leaders and policy at the moment, would be kind of one of suspicion.
Okay, so Lena has a question. She thanks you for a very interesting talk that resonates with her experiences. And she wonders if it's helpful to think of whether we need to, that this idea of social leadership rests upon individuals, so therefore is very vulnerable to change. Did your participants talk about the precariousness of their leadership, and were they aware of it?
Yes, and so this was a huge part about the investing in others leadership, I think. So a word that I ended up taking off the slide in order to prioritize brevity was sustainability. That one of the reasons for investing in the leadership of others was that they felt that that was a route to sustainable change within the sector. So yes, they engaged in kind of wider policy conversations and wider social conversations about early childhood education. And they did that because they felt it might bring about something useful. But really, where did they put lots of energy and attention was into growing leadership more broadly across the sector. So Nicole Mosti was the director of Erst Play School in Reykjavik, is now an Icelandic politician, very excitingly, but she talks about this so passionately, that you have to just be constantly growing leaders everywhere. You can't hoard your own leadership, because there won't be any real change within the sector if you do that.
Okay, Himali has a question here. She's got a point of clarification. Could you please explain what extent of difference does social leadership bring or can bring upon the grassroots practical reality of early childhood that's pursued today?
Yeah, so at the moment it happens through organisation. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's about how does that leadership well, we've interviewed leaders who are at the top of an organisation, how does it actually affect what happens on the ground? And I think that is, that's the point of the social purpose, and that's the point of the social pedagogy, is that you get to a point where you are affecting grassroots change. So the mechanism at the moment is organizational. So I guess in order to feel it as a professional, you need to be working in an organization that's led by a social leader. But I think the ideal would be to think about ways that you could more systemically develop social leadership so that that was much more widespread. So you think about the conditions in which social leadership flourishes, and you see if you can agitate for those conditions.
Okay, well, that helpfully addresses Nikki Fairchild's question about organisational culture being needing to be a focus too, and that leadership needs to be reframed so it's part of the role and it's not seen as an add-on. I think that's pretty much what you were arguing then. Lisa is saying she'd like to talk to you about bringing it into her module on leadership and management. A functional question from Tarun. If one was to share this ahead, where would one guide people to understand your research and contact you?
Yeah, great question. So we have a book coming out, but it's not out yet. There are 2 Nursery World articles that give a kind of taster of social leadership, as it were. And I will happily supply my email address in the chat too. So I can link to those in the chat and put my email address in the chat as well.
Okay, so Jacqueline Harding is just agreeing with the conversation that we were having, that so little has changed over the last decade or so, and this is the exciting potential of this new dialogue and reframing. A question from Christine: do you think it is something which can be taught in terms of justifying this idea as being the focus of leadership rather than the requirement to evidence children's progress? As my experience is that leaders are so focused on assessment as a driver for practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's that thing of the tail wagging the dog, isn't it? So you start with kind of what you have to demonstrate. And that's what I was trying to get across with those, where are we at with models of leadership? It's not that they are assessment driven at all, but what they are trying to offer is a really practical way of keeping everything in the air at the same time and juggling everything. And actually what there needs to be, I think, is real bravery to say, no, it's the social purpose. And you have much more freedom within particular contexts. So again, Nicole Lee Mosty was working within a state provider, and so could say, in line with my social purpose, I took the brave decision to run a small deficit, because actually I felt that without doing that, I wasn't managing to achieve the social purpose. Now, that's not something that's kind of available to a private provider, but it is about that kind of taking the social purpose and putting it back at the center of all decision making, and even the decision making about assessment.
Yeah. One question I was thinking that's just been sort of whizzing through my head, which is this idea that we have sort of flattened hierarchies, and that everybody's kind of instilled with the belief that they can pursue a leadership kind of agenda in their own work, whatever level they're at. Is there then a risk that everybody's leading and there's who's doing the following, or are they all, what are they leading on? I know that there are some benefits of having hierarchies and having clear demarcation and sets of responsibilities for pedagogical leadership or for financial leadership, and not everybody can do all of those things or wants to do all of those things. So this idea that everybody can lead everything in this kind of flattened, hierarchical, collaborative way, is there kind of potential for just a big mess to start to emerge in that sort of context?
I think there is, if you take the social purpose out of the equation. So really central is everybody understanding what the social purpose is, and what they are in a position then, how they can further that social purpose relative to their position, their context, their kind of sphere of influence, as it were. So no, I don't think there is room for mess if everybody's on board with the social purpose. So that draws us to kind of that theory of invisible leadership, that actually the most important thing within an organization is a kind of clarity of, this is the purpose, this is why we do what we do. And honestly, and I'm not just saying this because of partnership with June, the interviews that I did within Leaf really massively changed my thinking about what was possible in terms of people understanding a shared sense of purpose and having that purpose in a really deep sense embedded within them, and then acting in leaderly ways throughout their day in whatever context, whatever role that they were approaching. And so that might be kind of, you know, a parent who's fed up and wants to have a conversation with somebody about something, and it's who steps up to have that conversation, and who steps up to have that conversation in a meaningful way. Well, that's the leadership behavior being demonstrated in that moment. So it's not a question of saying everybody's got access to the accounts and, you know, and everybody files the paperwork that needs to be filed, but that everybody can see that, okay, this is the purpose we're driving towards. This is the way in which I can drive towards that purpose during my day.
Okay. I'm just aware of the time. I think that this could rumble on for days, but which is great, because your email is m.sakr@mdx.ac.uk, and I'm sure you'd welcome follow up in any shape or form via email. So I'm just going to thank everyone for coming along, participating, and for your really thoughtful questions. And most of all, a big thank you to Mona for a really inspiring and thought-provoking presentation. And please join us for the next seminar, which is in June, which when we have Victoria de Rijke talking about Scribble. So as I said, a very diverse, broad church of scholars we have in the education department, but all very thought-provoking and interesting. And also, finally, just a thanks to Shams for the behind-the-scenes work. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.